So here's a thought. What if the biggest decisions nations make, the really big ones, are actually driven by ideology or even their history? What if it's something much more fundamental?
Like the ground beneath their feet.
Exactly. We're diving deep today into this really compelling idea that physical geography, the actual landscape, basically dictates a nation's destiny.
It's a powerful lens, isn't it?
Yeah.
In our whole discussion today, it's based on a detailed look at Tim Marshall's, well, a really influential 2015 book, Prisoners of Geography. 10 maps that tell you everything you need to know about global politics.
Yeah, great book. And our goal for you listening is to unlock a totally new way of looking at the world map. We want you to understand why countries act the way they do, maybe get some insights that go, way beyond the daily news cycle.
I think you'll find some real aha moments here.
I definitely did.
So Marshall's main idea, his thesis, is pretty stark. Geography is destiny. He basically argues that leaders, well, they often aren't nearly as free to choose as we might think.
Right, they're constrained.
Constrained, exactly, by the mountains, the rivers, the seas, the deserts, even the borders they inherit. His point is that terrain and natural boundaries, they often play a much more foundational role than, say, political ideas or even historical grievances.
Okay, so how does he make that case? How does geography dictate things rather than just, influence them? It sounds almost like geopolitical determinism.
Well, he doesn't discount other factors entirely, but he argues geography is the bedrock. And to really show this, he uses these 10 detailed regional maps. They're key. He shows how specific physical features influence, well, pretty much everything. Political choices, economic growth, even war and alliances.
Showing us the kind of underlying structure of it all.
Precisely, the physical stage on which politics plays out.
Okay, let's get into some examples. Russia seems like a classic case he uses. What's the geographical story there? Security, right?
Absolutely. Russia's geography, Marshall argues, breeds this profound sense of insecurity. And it mainly comes down to its western borders. They're incredibly flat, wide open, specifically the North European plain.
That huge flat expanse.
Yeah, stretching right across Europe into Russia. Historically, it's been like an open highway for invaders. Think Napoleon, think Hitler. It leaves them feeling constantly vulnerable from the West.
So if you've got this massive vulnerability, what's the response, geographically speaking?
Well, Marshall points to Russia's historical obsession almost with creating buffer zones. Think about places like Ukraine. From Moscow's perspective, having that cushion isn't just expansionism for its own sake. It's seen as vital for strategic survival.
A defensive depth.
Exactly. And beyond that land vulnerability, there's another huge constraint: the lack of warm water ports. Access to the sea year-round for trade and naval power has always been a struggle.
Which you can totally see driving actions like in Crimea, right? Access to the Black Sea.
Precisely. Marshall connects these geographic imperatives directly to modern geopolitical moves. It adds this whole other layer to understanding their actions.
Okay, let's shift east. China. A very different geographic picture, I imagine.
Yeah, quite different, especially historically. For centuries, China was relatively isolated by these massive natural barriers. You've got the Himalayas to the southwest, the Gobi Desert to the north.
Natural walls, basically.
Pretty much, which allowed it to develop its own distinct civilization, largely protected from outside forces for a long time.
But today, that isolation is gone. What are the geographic priorities now? It seems much more outward-looking.
Absolutely. Today's priorities are, well, maintaining tight control over critical border regions, Tibet, Xinjiang. Those are key for stability and resources. Also, securing guaranteed access to the sea is huge.
Especially the South China Sea, right? That seems central.
Central, yes, for trade routes and projecting power. And that leads directly to things like the Belt and Road Initiative. Marshall frames it as this massive strategic play.
How so?
It's about creating alternative trade routes, land-based ones, to bypass potential maritime choke points like the Strait of Malacca that could be controlled by rivals. It's geography shaping grand strategy.
Makes sense. Okay, turning to the United States. Marshall calls it geographically blessed. What makes the U.S. so fortunate in its geography?
Well, look at the map. You've got vast amounts of fertile land, perfect for agriculture and supporting a large population. Then, critically, it's buffered by two enormous oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific.
Natural moats.
Gigantic ones. And crucially, its immediate neighbors, Canada and Mexico, don't pose major conventional military threats. That combination is, frankly, unique on a global scale.
And how did this geographic blessing shape its role in the world? Marshall talks about this sort of paradox being insulated but also expansionist.
Right. It's interesting because they didn't have to constantly worry about defending land borders like, say, Germany or Poland. The U.S. was insulated from many old world conflicts, at least initially.
Which gave it space to develop internally.
Exactly. But that same insulation, ironically, freed it up. It allowed the U.S. to look outwards and project power globally when it chose to, intervening far from its own shores without the constant fear of immediate invasion that shapes so many other nations' thinking.
That's a fascinating take. What about Western Europe? A very different story there. Lots of different countries packed together.
Completely different. Marshall argues that Europe's fragmented geography, all those mountains, peninsulas, islands, distinct river valleys, historically led to the development of numerous competing states.
Instead of one unified empire like China for a long time.
Precisely. And that competition, he suggests, actually spurred innovation. Different ideas, technologies, political systems battling it out.
And trade must have been key, too. All that coastline and those rivers.
Absolutely crucial. Navigable rivers like the Rhine and Danube, plus easy access to the sea, fueled widespread trade, exploration, and ultimately colonialism. It gave them a huge advantage.
So the European Union, is that an attempt to finally overcome this geographic fragmentation?
In many ways, yes. It's a massive political project aimed at knitting together these historically divided nations. But, as Marshall points out, geography still matters within the EU.
How so?
Different countries still have different geographic realities, different resources, different strategic concerns based on their location. Think about energy dependence or proximity to Russia or migration routes. Geography continues to fuel divergent national interests, making that unity project a constant work in progress.
Right. Now, Africa. Marshall presents his geography as a major constraint. What are the key challenges there?
It's almost the opposite of Europe in some ways. You have vast unifying features like the Sahara Desert, but they act as massive barriers. There are relatively few, easily navigable rivers that connect the interior deep inland with the coast.
Unlike, say, the Mississippi in the U.S.
Exactly. And the coastline itself often lacks good natural harbors. This makes internal trade, communication, and development incredibly difficult. Geography itself hinders connection.
And then layered on top of that, you have the colonial legacy.
A huge factor. Those artificial borders drawn by European powers, often straight lines on a map, completely ignored existing ethnic groups, trade routes, and the physical landscape.
Which just baked in conflict from the start.
Sadly, yes. It contributed massively to internal strife that continues today. So even though Africa is incredibly rich in natural resources, these geographic hurdles, compounded by governance issues and that colonial history, make it hard to translate that wealth into widespread development.
It's a tough hand dealt by geography.
Definitely.
Moving to the Middle East, another region where borders seem absolutely critical to the story.
Critical and, again, often artificial, Marshall really emphasizes the impact of colonial map drawing, like the Sykes-Picot Agreement during World War I.
Where Britain and France basically carved up the Ottoman Empire between themselves.
Exactly, with little regard for the people living there, the ethnic or religious lines. They created states like Iraq and Syria with inherent internal divisions, sowing seeds of conflict that are still bearing bitter fruit.
And on top of those borders, you have the resources. Oil, obviously, but also water.
Absolutely. Competition for oil-rich land is a constant flashpoint. But water scarcity is arguably an even deeper, more existential issue in much of the region. Control over rivers like the Tigris, Euphrates, or the Jordan is intensely political.
And the terrain itself, deserts, mountains, does that tend to divide people further?
It certainly does. It reinforces tribal or regional identities over national ones in many areas. It makes central control difficult and often allows conflicts to fester in remote areas. Geography really complicates unity.
Okay, let's look at India and Pakistan. How does geography shape their relationship, which is obviously tense?
Well, for India, Marshall suggests its geography generally promotes internal unity. The Indo-Gangetic Plain, the Deccan Plateau, sort of bound by mountains and sea. But those same mountains, the Himalayas, act as a massive barrier, limiting its influence northwards towards China.
A natural wall there, too.
A very big one. Pakistan, on the other hand, is geographically much more challenging. It's relatively narrow, elongated, making it feel strategically vulnerable, especially its densely populated core along the Indus River.
And Kashmir seems central to their conflict, geographically speaking.
Hugely central. It sits at the headwaters of the Indus River system, which Pakistan is heavily dependent on. So for Pakistan, it's about strategic depth and water security. For India, it's about territorial integrity and denying that strategic ground to Pakistan.
Water security. That sounds like a recurring theme.
It's massive, especially concerning the Indus. That shared river system is a lifeline for both, but particularly Pakistan, making it a constant potential source of friction.
Right. What about Korea and Japan? Neighbors, but very different geographic situations.
Very different. Korea, Marshall describes as being in this incredibly tough spot, a geopolitical pivot point. Meaning it's strategically located right between major powers, China, Russia, Japan, with the U.S. also heavily involved. It's historically been a battleground or a buffer zone, caught in the middle of larger power struggles. Its location is its curse, in a way.
Stuck in the middle.
Pretty much. Japan, being an island nation, has a completely different story. That insularity allowed it to develop a unique culture and provided a degree of security for much of its history.
But that isolation comes with a cost, right?
Resources.
Exactly. Japan has very few natural resources of its own. It's heavily reliant on imports for energy, minerals, even food. That dependence shapes its foreign policy and its need to secure sea lanes.
Okay, let's swing over to Latin America. Why has it been so hard, historically, to achieve unity across that continent? Geography again?
Marshall argues, yes, very much so. You have massive geographic barriers fragmenting the continent. The Andes Mountains are a huge wall down the western side. The Amazon rainforest is vast and difficult to penetrate or cross.
And the rivers don't connect things easily?
Generally, no. Not like the Mississippi system in North America or the rivers of Europe. There isn't a great internal waterway system linking the major population centers. This geographic fragmentation made political unity very difficult to achieve and maintain after independence from Spain and Portugal. Which helps explain why Brazil is the dominant power there.
Size matters, definitely. Brazil is enormous, has abundant resources, and does have extensive river networks, particularly the Amazon basin. Even if it's challenging to develop, that gives it a natural weight on the continent.
Though it still faces huge internal challenges, inequality, infrastructure.
Yeah, absolutely. Geography gives it potential, but realizing that potential across such a vast and varied landscape is an ongoing struggle.
Finally, one region that's changing dramatically because of forces altering geography: the Arctic.
Yes, this is fascinating. For centuries, the Arctic was largely inaccessible, a frozen wasteland from a geopolitical perspective. But climate change is rapidly melting the ice.
Opening it up.
Opening it up completely.
Yeah.
Suddenly, you have the potential for new, shorter shipping routes, the Northwest Passage, the Northern Sea Route, and access to potentially vast reserves of oil, gas, and minerals that were previously locked away under the ice.
So it's becoming a new frontier for competition.
Absolutely. A new geopolitical hotspot. You have Russia, the U.S., Canada, Norway, Denmark, all making claims, increasing military presence. It's like a whole new ocean is appearing on the map, and everyone wants a piece of the action. Geography is literally being rewritten by climate change.
Wow. Okay, so pulling back from the specific regions, what are the big overarching themes Marshall keeps coming back to?
Well, the biggest one, obviously, is that core idea. Geography as destiny, or at least a primary constraint. He really hammers home that countries are profoundly shaped, even limited, by their physical terrain.
And no amount of clever diplomacy or ideology can completely escape that physical reality.
That's his argument. Which leads to the second theme. A lot of foreign policy isn't really about grand ideals, but about basic survival and security, driven by geography.
Like needing access to trade routes, needing buffer zones against invasion, needing energy supplies.
Exactly. These fundamental geographic needs often dictate strategic behavior more than anything else.
Which also suggests limits to the power of ideology. Right.
Yes. Marshall uses geography to explain actions that might seem purely ideological or irrational otherwise. Think about Russia and Crimea again, or China building islands in the South China Sea.
He'd say those aren't just about political systems, but about securing vital sea access or strategic depth geographic imperatives.
Precisely. Geography provides a different, often more fundamental explanation.
And the final theme, I guess, is the inherent inequality of it all. Some places just got luckier with their geography.
That's a stark conclusion, but yes, some nations, like the U.S., drew a very fortunate geographic hand resources, buffers, climate. Others, maybe many states in Africa, for example, face enormous geographic disadvantages from the start. Harsh climates, difficult terrain, lack of navigable rivers. Geography deals an uneven hand.
Okay, so looking at the book itself, Prisoners of Geography, what are its main strengths as a way to understand the world?
I think its biggest strength is clarity. It takes these really complex geopolitical ideas and makes them accessible, even if you're totally new to the subject. Marshall writes very clearly.
And using the maps as the framework is powerful.
Hugely powerful. It's visual. You see the mountains, you see the plains, you see the choke points. It makes the arguments much more intuitive and memorable.
Yeah, it helps connect the dots between the landscape and the headlines.
Exactly. It gives you a practical framework for understanding why certain regions are constantly in the news, why certain conflicts keep flaring up. It provides that long-term physical perspective.
But no framework is perfect. What are some of the limitations or criticisms of this heavily geographic approach?
Well, the main one is probably simplification, or maybe oversimplification. By focusing so heavily on geography, some critics argue it can downplay other crucial factors,
Like,
like the role of specific leaders and their choices, the impact of culture, the power of evolving ideologies, or even just historical accidents and technological change. Geography is powerful, but it's not the only thing.
that makes sense. It can feel a bit deterministic at times.
It can lean that way. Also, because it was published in 2015, some specific examples or the immediate context might feel slightly dated. The world moves fast.
Like the Russia-Ukraine situation has obviously escalated massively since then.
Right. The underlying geographic drivers Marshall identifies are still relevant, absolutely. But the immediate political landscape has shifted. You have to read it with that 2015 lens in mind for some specifics.
And one other point, it describes the problems really well, but doesn't necessarily offer solutions, right?
That's fair. It's much more descriptive than prescriptive. It explains why nations face certain geographic challenges, but it doesn't spend much time on policy recommendations for how they might overcome them, if that's even possible. It diagnoses the prisons but doesn't hand out keys.
Still, it sounds like a really valuable way to think about global politics.
Oh, absolutely. Despite any limitations, it's a fantastic introduction and a powerful reminder. Marshall's core point holds strong. If you really want to understand why nations act the way they do, their ambitions, their fears, you absolutely have to understand their map. You have to understand their geography.
So, maybe a final thought for everyone listening as they look at the world map next time. If geography really is destiny, or at least a major part of it, like Marshall suggests,
Right.
how much freedom, how much agency do nations actually have?
Hmm.
And maybe more importantly, as technology keeps changing,
Yeah.
building massive infrastructure, digital connections, maybe even mitigating climate change someday, do these geographic prisons become less confining? Or do the bars just get reshaped in new, maybe unexpected ways?
That's the big question, isn't it? Does technology ultimately conquer geography or just change the terms of imprisonment? Something definitely worth pondering.